The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Mitchell walked toward the small cafe near the training grounds. She wore simple civilian clothes, a plain blue dress, and comfortable shoes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a worn leather briefcase. To anyone watching, she looked like just another visitor to the base. Sarah had arrived at Camp Henderson 3 days ago, but she had kept a low profile. She wanted to observe the base operations without anyone knowing who she really was. As the newly appointed Admiral, she believed in understanding her command from the ground up. She had worked too hard to get where she was to make assumptions about how things really worked. The cafe was busy with soldiers grabbing their morning coffee before duty. Sarah found a small table near the window and sat down quietly. She opened a newspaper and pretended to read while actually listening to the conversations around her. She wanted to understand the morale of the troops, their concerns, and how the base really functioned when the brass wasn't watching. A young waitress approached her table. The girl looked nervous and tired. "What can I get you, ma'am?" she asked softly. "Just a coffee, please." "Black," Sarah replied with a gentle smile. As Sarah waited, she noticed the interactions between the soldiers and staff. Most were professional, but she could see signs of stress and fatigue. The base had been through some difficult times recently, and it showed in the way people moved and spoke. Her coffee arrived, and Sarah continued her quiet observation. She made mental notes about things she wanted to address once she officially took command. The facility needed some improvements, and the soldiers deserved better support. About 20 minutes later, a commotion started near the counter. A tall soldier with sergeant stripes was arguing loudly with the same young waitress who had served Sarah. His voice carried across the small cafe, and other customers began to stare. "This coffee is cold," the sergeant shouted. "I specifically asked for it hot. Are you people incapable of following simple instructions?" The waitress, whose name tag read Emma, looked close to tears. "I'm sorry, Sergeant Davis. I can make you a fresh cup right away." "Sorry doesn't cut it," Davis snarled. "This is the 3rd time this week you've messed up my order. Maybe you're too stupid to work here." Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she watched the scene unfold. The sergeant was clearly out of line, but she forced herself to remain seated and observe. She needed to see how the situation would be handled. Emma hurried back to the coffee machine with shaking hands. Other soldiers in the cafe watched uncomfortably, but no one intervened. Sarah could see that this kind of behavior was probably common, which troubled her deeply. When Emma returned with the fresh coffee, her hands were trembling so badly that she accidentally spilled a few drops on the counter. Sergeant Davis exploded with rage. "Now look what you've done," he roared. "You're completely useless. No wonder this base is falling apart when they hire people like you." That was when Sarah decided she had seen enough. She stood up calmly and walked toward the counter. Her years of military training had taught her to assess situations quickly and act decisively. "Excuse me," she said in a clear, steady voice. "Is there a problem here?" Sergeant Davis turned to look at her with obvious irritation. He saw a woman in civilian clothes who looked to be in her 30s, unremarkable except for her confident posture and direct gaze. "This doesn't concern you, lady," he said dismissively. "This is a military matter." "I can see that," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm just wondering if there's a better way to handle whatever the issue is." Davis's face reddened with anger. "Listen, sweetheart, why don't you mind your own business? This waitress can't do her job properly, and I'm making sure she knows it." Sarah looked at Emma, who was now crying quietly behind the counter. Then she turned back to Davis. "I think you've made your point. Perhaps we could resolve this more professionally." "Professionally?" Davis laughed harshly. "Who do you think you are to lecture me about professionalism? You're just some civilian who wandered onto a military base." The cafe had gone completely quiet now. Everyone was watching the confrontation unfold. Sarah remained calm, but those who knew her well would have recognized the dangerous glint in her eyes. "You're right that I'm not in uniform today," she said quietly. "But that doesn't mean I don't understand military protocol and proper conduct. Davis stepped closer to her, tried to intimidate her with his size and aggressive posture. Protocol? Lady, the only protocol you need to worry about is staying out of military business. Now, why don't you go back to your little table and drink your coffee like a good girl? Sarah didn't back down an inch. And why don't you treat your fellow service members with the respect they deserve? That's when Davis completely lost his temper. He grabbed the cup of hot coffee that Emma had just prepared and held it threateningly. You want to see disrespect? I'll show you what happens when civilians stick their nose where it doesn't belong. Before anyone could react, Davis threw the hot coffee directly at Sarah. The scalding liquid hit her chest and arms, soaking through her dress and causing immediate, searing pain. The entire cafe gasped in shock. Sarah stood there for a moment, coffee dripping from her clothes, her skin already reddening from the heat. The pain was intense, but she didn't cry out or show any emotion. Years of military training had taught her to maintain composure, even in the worst circumstances. Davis looked satisfied with himself. Maybe that'll teach you to mind your own business, he said smugly. Next time, stay in your lane. Emma rushed forward with towels, her face pale with horror. Oh my God, are you okay? I'm so sorry, this is all my fault. Sarah gently took the towels from Emma's shaking hands. This is not your fault, she said firmly, her voice still steady despite the pain. Not at all. She began dabbing at the coffee stains while Davis stood there looking proud of what he had done. Other soldiers in the cafe looked uncomfortable, but seemed afraid to challenge a sergeant. You should go to the medical center, Emma whispered urgently. That coffee was really hot. You might need treatment for burns. Sarah nodded, still maintaining her calm demeanor. I think that's a good idea. She looked directly at Davis, who was still standing there with his arms crossed, showing no remorse for his actions. Sergeant Davis, she said, memorizing his name from his uniform. I hope you're proud of yourself. He shrugged. I don't have a problem with what I did. Maybe you learned something today about respecting the military. Sarah picked up her briefcase and walked toward the door. As she passed Davis, she paused for just a moment. Oh, I definitely learned something today, she said quietly. More than you can imagine. As she left the cafe, Sarah could hear Davis bragging to his friends about putting the uppity civilian in her place. She walked steadily toward the medical center, her mind already working on how she would address this situation once she officially took command. The medical staff treated her burns, which were painful, but not severe. As the nurse applied cool compresses and bandages, Sarah thought about what she had witnessed. Davis's behavior wasn't just unprofessional. It was indicative of a larger problem with discipline and leadership on the base. She had planned to announce her arrival and take command in a formal ceremony later that week. But after what had happened, she decided to move up her timeline. The soldiers at Camp Henderson needed to understand what kind of leadership they would have, and they needed to understand it soon. That afternoon, Sarah made several phone calls from her temporary quarters. She spoke with her aide-de-camp, the base's current commanding officer, and several other key personnel. Plans were quickly put in motion for an unexpected announcement the following morning. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah looked at the bandages on her arms where the coffee had burned her. The pain was a reminder of what had happened, but it was also motivation for what needed to come next. Sergeant Davis had no idea that his actions that morning would have consequences far beyond anything he could imagine. He had humiliated someone he thought was powerless, but he was about to learn just how wrong he had been. The next morning would bring revelations that would shock everyone at Camp Henderson, especially one particular sergeant who thought he could treat people however he wanted without facing any consequences. Sarah Mitchell, the new Admiral, was about to make her presence known in a way that no one would ever forget. The next morning arrived with unusual activity at Camp Henderson. Word had spread quickly through unofficial channels that something big was happening. Soldiers who normally started their day with casual routines found themselves ordered to report to the main assembly hall by 0800 hours. Sergeant Davis woke up in his usual mood, still feeling pleased with himself about the previous day's incident. He had told the story several times to different groups of soldiers, each time making himself sound more heroic and the civilian woman more deserving of what she got. You should have seen her face, he bragged to his bunkmate while getting dressed. She thought she could come onto our base and tell us how to behave. I showed her what happens when civilians don't know their place. His bunkmate, Private Johnson, looked uncomfortable. I heard she got burned pretty badly, Sarge. Maybe you went too far. Davis laughed as he adjusted his uniform. Too far? Johnson, sometimes you have to make an example of people. That woman learned a valuable lesson about respecting the military. As they made their way to the assembly hall with hundreds of other soldiers, Davis continued to boast about his actions. He had no idea that his victim from the coffee shop was already at the base, preparing for the most important announcement of her career. In her temporary office, Admiral Sarah Mitchell was making final preparations for the ceremony. She had spent the early morning hours reviewing personnel files, including one for a certain Sergeant Davis. What she found there only reinforced her determination to address the discipline problems at the base. Davis had a history of aggressive behavior and complaints from subordinates, but his actions had always been covered up or minimized by his superiors. He had been transferred to Camp Henderson after an incident at his previous posting that had been quietly swept under the rug. Sarah's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, knocked on her door. "Admiral, everything is ready for the ceremony. The entire base personnel are assembled." "Thank you, Reynolds," Sarah replied, adjusting her dress uniform. The gold stripes on her sleeves gleamed in the morning light, and her chest was decorated with numerous ribbons and medals earned through years of distinguished service. "Have you briefed the current base commander?" "Yes, ma'am. Colonel Murphy is aware of the situation and will handle the formal introduction. He's quite surprised by yesterday's events, to say the least." Sarah nodded. Colonel Murphy had been the interim commander since the previous admiral's retirement. He was a good officer, but had clearly lost control of discipline on the base. That would be changing very quickly. In the assembly hall, soldiers were filing into neat rows, speculating about why they had been called together on such short notice. The room was buzzing with conversations and theories. Sergeant Davis found a spot near the middle of the formation, still regaling nearby soldiers with his story. "I'm telling you, guys, these civilians need to learn respect. That woman got exactly what she deserved." Corporal Martinez, who had been in the cafe and witnessed the incident, shook his head. "Davis, that was really messed up. She wasn't bothering anyone. She was just trying to help Emma." "Help?" Davis scoffed. "She was interfering with military discipline. I had every right to put her in her place." The conversations gradually died down as Colonel Murphy took the stage, looking unusually serious. The soldiers snapped to attention automatically. At ease, Murphy commanded, and the formation relaxed slightly. "You're all here this morning for a very important announcement. As you know, Camp Henderson has been without a permanent commanding officer since Admiral Harrison's retirement 3 months ago." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Everyone had been wondering when a new commander would be assigned. "Today, I have the honor of introducing your new commanding officer," Murphy continued. "Admiral Sarah Mitchell comes to us with an outstanding record of service, including combat deployments in 3 different theaters and extensive experience in base management and personnel development." Davis barely paid attention to the introduction. He was more interested in scanning the crowd for friends to share his coffee shop story with later. "Admiral Mitchell has actually been on base for several days," Murphy announced, causing some surprised looks among the soldiers. "She wanted to observe our operations and get a feel for the base before formally taking command." That got Davis's attention. He frowned slightly, wondering if the new admiral had heard about his exemplary handling of the civilian woman. He hoped she had. It would show her that he was exactly the kind of strong leader the base needed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Murphy said with a gesture toward the side of the stage, "I present Admiral Sarah Mitchell, your new commanding officer." The side door opened, and Admiral Mitchell walked onto the stage in her full dress uniform. Her posture was perfect, her presence commanding, and her face was set in an expression of calm authority. The entire assembly hall fell silent as she approached the podium. Then, gradually, a few soldiers began to recognize her. Whispers started in different parts of the formation. Sergeant Davis felt his stomach drop as he stared at the woman on stage. It couldn't be. It absolutely could not be. But there was no denying it. The woman he had humiliated and burned with hot coffee the day before was now standing in front of them wearing an admiral's uniform. "Oh no," he whispered, his face going pale. "Oh no, oh no, oh no." Corporal Martinez looked at him with growing realization. "Davis isn't that." "Shut up," Davis hissed, but it was too late. Other soldiers who had been in the cafe were also making the connection. Word began to spread rapidly through the formation like wildfire. Admiral Mitchell stepped up to the microphone with the same calm composure she had shown the day before. Her eyes swept across the assembled soldiers, and, for just a moment, they lingered on Sergeant Davis. "Good morning," she began, her clear voice carrying easily through the hall. "I'm honored to be here at Camp Henderson and to have the opportunity to serve alongside all of you." Davis felt like he might be sick. This had to be some kind of nightmare. The woman he had attacked and humiliated was an admiral, not just any officer, but the new commanding officer of the entire base. "As Colonel Murphy mentioned, I've been on base for several days observing your operations," Admiral Mitchell continued. "I believe in understanding an organization from the ground up before making any decisions about leadership or policy." Her tone was professional and measured, but Davis could swear she was looking directly at him. "During my time here, I've seen many examples of professionalism, dedication, and the kind of teamwork that makes the military strong," she said. "I've also seen some things that concern me deeply." The hall was completely silent now. You could have heard a pin drop. Every soldier was focused intently on their new commanding officer. Military service is built on core values: honor, courage, commitment, integrity, and respect, Admiral Mitchell said, her voice gaining intensity. "These are not just words we say during ceremonies. They are the foundation of everything we do." Davis was sweating now, despite the cool temperature in the hall. He could feel eyes turning toward him as word of the coffee shop incident spread through the ranks. "When we fail to uphold these values, when we abuse our authority or mistreat others, we undermine everything the military stands for," the Admiral continued. "We become bullies instead of leaders, tyrants instead of protectors." She paused and looked directly at the section where Davis was standing. "Yesterday morning, I witnessed an incident that perfectly illustrated what happens when these values are forgotten." The tension in the room was palpable now. Davis wanted to run, to hide, to disappear completely, but he was trapped in formation with hundreds of witnesses. "I saw a service member verbally abuse a civilian employee, humiliate her in front of others, and then physically assault a person who tried to intervene," Admiral Mitchell said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. Davis closed his eyes, hoping against hope that this was all some terrible dream. "The service member in question threw scalding coffee on someone who was simply trying to de-escalate a situation," she continued. "He showed no remorse, no professionalism, and no understanding of what it means to wear the uniform." By now, every soldier in Davis's vicinity was staring at him. His reputation for aggression was well known, and many had heard him bragging about the coffee shop incident. Admiral Mitchell's voice remained steady and controlled. That service member thought he was putting an uppity civilian in her place. What he actually did was assault his new commanding officer. The gasp that went up from the assembled soldiers was audible throughout the hall. Davis felt his knees go weak as the full magnitude of his situation hit him. "Sergeant Davis," Admiral Mitchell said, her voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. "Please step forward." Davis felt like his feet were made of lead. Every step toward the front of the formation felt like walking toward his own execution. Behind him, he could hear whispers and murmurs from the other soldiers. When he finally reached the front of the formation, he stood at attention, unable to meet Admiral Mitchell's eyes. Up close, he could see the professional bandages on her arms where the coffee had burned her. "Sergeant Davis," she said, her voice carrying to the entire assembly, "do you have anything to say about yesterday's incident?" Davis's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry? That he didn't know who she was? That he thought he was justified in his actions? He started, then stopped. His voice cracked as he tried again. I didn't know. I thought you were... You thought I was what, Sergeant? Admiral Mitchell asked calmly. A powerless civilian who deserved to be humiliated and assaulted. The words hit Davis like physical blows. I made a mistake. Yes, you did, Admiral Mitchell agreed. Multiple mistakes, in fact. You abused your authority, you mistreated a civilian employee, you showed complete disrespect for military values, and you physically assaulted someone who was trying to help. Davis stood there in silence, knowing that anything he said would only make things worse. But the biggest mistake you made, Sergeant Davis, was thinking that your rank gave you the right to treat people as less than human, she continued. That kind of thinking has no place in my command. The Admiral turned to address the entire assembly again. Let me be absolutely clear about something. The incident yesterday didn't bother me because I'm an Admiral and he's a Sergeant. It bothered me because it was wrong, period. If I had been a private, a civilian, or anyone else, his behavior would have been equally unacceptable. She looked back at Davis, who was still standing rigidly at attention, sweat beading on his forehead. Military rank is not a license to abuse others, she said. Leadership is not about intimidation or humiliation. True leadership is about service, protection, and setting an example that others want to follow. The silence in the hall was deafening. Davis could feel the eyes of hundreds of his fellow soldiers on him, and he knew that his military career was effectively over. Admiral Mitchell wasn't finished. Effective immediately, Sergeant Davis, you are relieved of all duties pending a full investigation into yesterday's incident and your overall conduct record. You will report to the military police for processing. 2 MPs who had been waiting at the side of the hall stepped forward. Davis finally looked up at Admiral Mitchell, his eyes pleading for mercy that he knew he didn't deserve. Admiral, please, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Admiral Mitchell looked at him for a long moment before responding. The fact that you didn't know who I was is irrelevant, Sergeant. Your behavior would have been wrong regardless of my rank or position. That's something you should have learned a long time ago. As the MPs escorted Davis from the hall, Admiral Mitchell turned back to address the remaining soldiers. The lesson was clear to everyone present. The days of tolerating abuse and unprofessional conduct at Camp Anderson were over. The woman that Sergeant Davis had tried to humiliate and silence had turned out to be the one person who could end his career with a single word. His assumption that she was powerless had been his downfall, and now everyone on the base understood exactly what kind of leadership they could expect from their new admiral. The weeks following Admiral Mitchell's dramatic introduction to Camp Anderson were filled with sweeping changes that transformed the entire base culture. Word of the coffee shop incident and Davis's downfall spread throughout the military network, serving as a powerful reminder that actions have consequences regardless of who you think you're dealing with. Sergeant Davis found himself in military detention while awaiting his court-martial proceedings. The investigation into his conduct revealed a pattern of abuse and misconduct that stretched back years. Former subordinates and colleagues came forward with stories of intimidation, verbal abuse, and the kind of toxic leadership that Admiral Mitchell was determined to eliminate. In his cell, Davis had plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had led him to this point. The confident, arrogant man who had thrown hot coffee at a woman he thought was beneath him was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the weight of his actions. His military lawyer, Captain Roberts, visited him regularly to prepare his defense, but even she seemed discouraged by the mounting evidence against him. The prosecution has statements from 12 different people describing incidents of abuse or misconduct, she told him during one visit. Your former commanding officers admit they should have addressed your behavior years ago instead of just transferring you to different bases. Davis sat with his head in his hands. I know I messed up, Captain, but I never thought. What are the chances that woman would turn out to be an admiral? Captain Roberts looked at him with a mixture of frustration and pity. That's exactly the problem, Davis. You're still focusing on who she was instead of what you did. If you had thrown hot coffee on a private, a civilian, or a janitor, it would have been equally wrong. The reality was slowly sinking in for Davis, but it might have been too little, too late. Meanwhile, Admiral Mitchell was working tirelessly to rebuild the culture at Camp Henderson. She implemented new training programs focused on leadership, respect, and professional conduct. She also established an anonymous reporting system that allowed soldiers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Emma, the young waitress who had been the target of Davis's initial abuse, found herself at the center of the base's transformation. Admiral Mitchell had personally visited her to apologize for what she had endured and to ensure she felt supported. "You have nothing to apologize for," Emma had told the Admiral tearfully. "You stood up for me when no one else would. I can't believe you took all of that abuse just to protect me." "That's what leaders do," Admiral Mitchell had replied simply. "We protect those who can't protect themselves." The Admiral also implemented changes to the base's food service operations, ensuring that civilian employees received the same respect and protection as military personnel. She made it clear that mistreatment of anyone on the base, regardless of their position or rank, would result in immediate disciplinary action. As word of the new policies spread, Camp Henderson began attracting attention from military leadership across the country. Other bases started implementing similar programs, using Admiral Mitchell's approach as a model for positive change. The transformation wasn't just about policies, though. The Admiral made a point of being visible throughout the base, eating in the enlisted mess halls, participating in training exercises, and maintaining an open-door policy for any soldier who needed to speak with her. During one such visit to the base cafe where the original incident had occurred, Admiral Mitchell sat down with a group of junior enlisted personnel. The conversation was casual, but the message was clear. Everyone mattered, regardless of rank. "Admiral," one young private asked hesitantly, "what made you decide to handle the situation with Sergeant Davis the way you did? I mean, you could have just had him arrested immediately." Admiral Mitchell considered the question carefully. "I wanted everyone to understand that leadership isn't about using your power to hurt others. It's about using your power to protect them and to build them up. If I had just quietly dealt with Davis, the larger lesson would have been lost." The changes at Camp Henderson weren't limited to discipline and respect. Admiral Mitchell also focused on improving training facilities, updating equipment, and ensuring that soldiers had access to the resources they needed to excel in their duties. Morale, which had been low for months, began to improve dramatically. 6 weeks after the coffee shop incident, Sergeant Davis's court-martial finally began. The proceedings were held in the base's legal offices, with Admiral Mitchell scheduled to testify as the primary victim and witness. When Davis saw her enter the courtroom in her dress uniform, he was struck again by the magnitude of his mistake. The woman he had tried to humiliate now held his future in her hands, and he knew he deserved whatever punishment was coming. Admiral Mitchell's testimony was clear, professional, and devastating. She described the incident in detail, from Davis's initial abuse of Emma to his physical assault with the hot coffee. She spoke without emotion, simply stating the facts as they had occurred. "The defendant showed no remorse for his actions," she testified. "Even after assaulting me, he continued to brag about what he had done. His behavior demonstrated a complete lack of understanding of military values and professional conduct." During cross-examination, Davis's lawyer tried to argue that he had been provoked and that he hadn't known Admiral Mitchell's rank. The Admiral's response was swift and decisive. "My rank is irrelevant to this case," she stated firmly. "The defendant's actions would have been equally wrong if I had been a private, a civilian, or anyone else. The idea that rank determines how we should treat people is exactly the kind of thinking that has no place in the military." The prosecution also called Emma to testify about the original incident with Davis. She was nervous but clear in her description of how he had verbally abused her for a minor mistake. He made me feel like I was worthless, she said quietly. I was just trying to do my job, but he treated me like I wasn't even human. When that lady, Admiral Mitchell, stood up for me, it was the first time anyone had ever done that. Other witnesses testified about Davis's pattern of behavior over the years. Former subordinates described incidents of intimidation and abuse that painted a picture of someone who had repeatedly misused his authority. When it came time for Davis to testify in his own defense, he finally seemed to understand the gravity of his situation. Gone was the arrogant bully who had thrown coffee at an innocent woman. In his place was a broken man who finally realized the pain he had caused others. I know what I did was wrong, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've spent weeks thinking about all the people I've hurt over the years, all the times I used my rank to make others feel small. I can't undo any of that. He looked directly at Admiral Mitchell, who sat in the gallery watching the proceedings. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm just sorry that it took something like this for me to see what I had become. The court-martial panel deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Davis was found guilty on multiple charges, including assault, conduct unbecoming a service member, and abuse of authority. He was sentenced to reduction in rank to private, 6 months in military prison, and a dishonorable discharge from the service. As the sentence was read, Davis closed his eyes and accepted his fate. His military career was over, and he would carry the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. After the proceedings ended, Admiral Mitchell was approached by several officers who wanted to discuss the case and its implications for military discipline. You've set a powerful precedent here, Colonel Murphy told her. Other commanders are already talking about how you handled this situation. Good, Admiral Mitchell replied. If this prevents even one person from being abused or humiliated by someone in authority, then it was worth it. In the months that followed, Camp Henderson became known throughout the military as a model for professional conduct and effective leadership. The base's performance metrics improved dramatically, and it became a preferred assignment for many soldiers who had heard about the positive culture Admiral Mitchell had created. Emma continued working at the base cafe, but now she did so with confidence and dignity. The Admiral had ensured that all civilian employees received training on their rights and had access to support if they ever faced mistreatment. I never thought that horrible day would lead to something so positive, Emma told a friend months later. Admiral Mitchell didn't just protect me that day. She changed everything for everyone here. The story of the coffee shop incident became legendary within military circles, not because of the dramatic revelation of Admiral Mitchell's identity, but because of the lessons it taught about leadership, respect, and the importance of treating all people with dignity. For Admiral Mitchell, the incident served as a constant reminder of why strong leadership mattered. She kept a small photo on her desk from the day she took command, showing her addressing the assembled troops with Sergeant Davis standing at attention in front of her. It wasn't a trophy or a symbol of victory. It was a reminder that leadership meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Davis, meanwhile, served his sentence and was released from the military in disgrace. He found work in construction, far from the military life that had once defined him. The arrogance and entitlement that had characterized his military career were gone, replaced by a hard-earned understanding of how his actions had affected others. He never attempted to contact Admiral Mitchell or Emma to apologize further. He understood that the best amends he could make was to live the rest of his life differently, treating others with the respect he had failed to show during his military service. Years later, when military leadership courses studied the Camp Henderson transformation, they always focused on Admiral Mitchell's approach to change and accountability. The coffee shop incident became a case study in how toxic leadership could be addressed and how positive change could spread throughout an organization. The lesson was clear. True leadership isn't about rank or authority. It's about character, respect, and the courage to do what's right, even when no one is watching. Admiral Mitchell had demonstrated that lesson perfectly, not just in how she handled the aftermath of the incident, but in how she had responded to abuse and assault while everyone thought she was powerless to fight back. In the end, Sergeant Davis's attempt to humiliate a woman he thought was beneath him had backfired spectacularly. But the real victory wasn't his downfall. It was the positive transformation that emerged from his failure and the better military culture that Admiral Mitchell built in its place.